But today, introduce Gunnar Sedleniak, who's a member. He's going to talk to us about Latvia. Go ahead. Let's see what Latvia looks like.
Thank you, Alan, and welcome to this morning's presentation. I'm going to talk to you about Latvia, and the first question we'll ask ourselves is, what is Latvia? And I'm always surprised how few people know about it. I'm sure here, of course, we're all well read and well traveled, so we've heard about Latvia. But I had a fellow engineer, and you know how smart engineers are, was absolutely convinced that this was a NASA program. It even had an acronym for it: Low Altitude Test Vehicle Model 1A. Other people have said it's another government funded program. And the one I like the best is that person told me that their mother had taken Latvia for years. It didn't do anything for nervous bowel syndrome. So let's find out about Latvia. Latvia is a country. It's a fairly small country. It's a relatively new country. It's been in existence about 100 years. And really only has been a sovereign country for about the last 30 years. And the term sovereign has always confused me, at least a little bit, as we think of a sovereign like the Queen of England is a sovereign, the Pope is a sovereign. And I think there's even well, there used to be a coin in Great Britain called a sovereign.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. So why is a sovereign nation a nation that is above, in Latin, the term derives from the Latin, of course, which means above all else. Is a sovereign nation above all other nations? But if you look into the definition, it really means that the people are the sovereign, and that's why it's called a sovereign nation. Now, the official term of Latvia is the Republic of Latvia. And of course, Republic meaning representative of the people. Nothing to do with the Republican Party or anything like that. Okay, so now we have found out a little bit about what Latvia is. Where is it? And that's a more puzzling question for a lot of people. So let's have a look at the map. Well, it's not in the Americas, certainly less likely to be anywhere in Asia. Might this be Latvia right here? No, it's Lake Victoria. But Lake Victoria is important. Lake Victoria, of course, is in the Rift Valley where we all originally came from, bordered by Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. But Lake Victoria is about 25,000 square miles. And to keep that in mind, because we're going to refer to that again. So we go up into Europe, we find that indeed there is, up in the very north of Europe, Latvia. Now Latvia looks a lot bigger here on the map than when I pointed to Lake Victoria, although the surface area is about the same. And the reason for that is most of the maps of the world that we look at are in Mercator projection. The Mercator projection takes the globe, projects it onto a cylinder, and then the cylinder is unwrapped into a map. So all the countries like Canada up here, Greenland, no, this is Iceland, the northern part of Russia and the Scandinavian countries appear unusually large. Compared to when you look at the countries closer to the equator. So keep that in mind when you look at maps in general. So now we know where Latvia is, we know what Latvia is, and I must tell you at this point, why am I so interested in Latvia? Well, that's where I was born. Oh. That's my fatherland. It was 82 years ago that I came into this world in that country. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit more about it. Let's switch over to our familiar Google map. And somebody, I think Steve, just asked me, what are the three Baltic countries? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They're on the Baltic Sea. there are three countries that are, as I mentioned before, fairly young countries. They didn't exist much over 100 years ago. They were previous to that pretty much part of Russia or some territory of Russia. Latvia is fairly high up north, and if we draw a parallel from Latvia across through the north of Scotland, and if we were going to go all the way around the world, we'd end up in about Juneau, Alaska. So that's fairly high northern territory. The other thing that's interesting about this map is the bottom of this map is at the 45th parallel, and I think we all know where that is. Portland is just a little bit above the 45th parallel. So we're actually more in line with France, Switzerland, the north of the southern part of Europe. If you go down to San Francisco, that's more on par with Rome. If you went down to Los Angeles, it'd be more on par with Cairo or Athens or someplace like that. So Latvia is quite a ways north, and it certainly is reflected in the kind of winter weather conditions that you have up there, much more so than, for instance, the British Isles are very much influenced by the Gulf Stream coming up here and warming it up. The northern European countries are more influenced by cold air masses coming out of Siberia. So the weather pattern in this area is much more severe than you might have experienced if you were living in Great Britain. I'm a numbers sort of a guy, so in order to size up Latvia and give us an appreciation for what we're talking about, let's look at some of the numbers. The first one is, as I mentioned before, relative to Lake Victoria. The surface area of the country is about 25,000 square miles. Now, that doesn't mean a whole lot to me, so let's compare that to the UK and Oregon, which are two areas that we're familiar with. Latvia is about a fourth of the size of the UK and Oregon, and to my surprise, at least, maybe I never much thought about it, I was surprised that the UK and Oregon are just about the same size in terms of land territory. In terms of population, Latvia has just shy of 2 million people. There were more people in Latvia at the time that they gained their independence in the early 90s, but because of the poor economic conditions, many people have left Latvia and moved to other European countries, a few to this country. Of the 2 million people, about 2/3 are native Latvians, or people who have lived there all along. 25% are Russians, and the Russians came along during the Stalin era. Stalin purged all business owners and landowners, sent them off to Siberian labor camps, including my maternal grandfather, who owned a restaurant and a hotel business in Latvia. He ultimately came back and regained his property, but when those Latvians left to go to Siberia, they were refilled by Russians that came from impoverished areas in Russia. And those Russians, of course, were better off in Latvia than wherever they came from, so they stayed. And much to the dislike of the Latvians, and it wasn't until Latvia joined the United Nations and it was incumbent on them to recognize all peoples in their countries, the Russians didn't have any voting rights in Latvia. Now, comparing the population, this is where things get really surprising. We look at the number of people in terms of the other two countries. You can see how many more people there are in the UK, 67 million, 4 million in Oregon. But what's interesting is the density. In the UK, it's about 10 times what it is in Latvia, in a very highly populated area. In terms of annual gross domestic product, Latvia is very small, $61 billion. That comes out to about $32,000 per individual. And not to be confused, this is not the income of the people in Latvia. It's much less than that. It's just for comparisons to the size of the population. Of course, the UK has about a $3 trillion GDP, or as they like to say in Britain, 3,000 billion.
Yeah.
So that's about 45,000 per capita. Whereas in Oregon, we have we don't measure GDP as such, but it's an equivalent of 252 billion, and that equates to about 60,000 per individual. Just a few words about the economy of Latvia. As already mentioned, the GDP is about 60 billion. Latvia has enjoyed a fairly good growth rate over the last few years. It tapered off a little bit in 2019 because the economy in Europe in general had taken a decline. Inflation has been fairly well under control again until this last year, when the result of the decline in productivity, the inflation increased. About 1 million people are in the labor force in Latvia out of the roughly 2 million that I mentioned. The employment rate is surprisingly low. Only about 3/4 of people are gainfully employed. The average gross salary is a meager $1,200 a month, and because of the Latvia being a fairly socialist country, you see people are paying a substantial amount in various taxes. So the take-home pay of an individual averages about $900 a month. So about $300 a month goes to various social services. So the population below the poverty line is about 25%, and Latvia is one of the most impoverished countries in the European Union. Even though with the improvement in the growth rate, it's got a long way to go. The main industries are processed foods and processed wood products, textiles and such, some pharmaceuticals, railroad cars, and rather primitive electronics. Latvia does not possess any natural resources to speak of, other than forests, wood products, and some farming. So they, and at that, in order to gain some, or to convert that into some revenue, they do export about 12 billion out of the 60 billion, which is quite impressive. But they also import a great deal of their necessities, particularly fuel. Fuel comes from, in the form of natural gas from Russia, as it does for too many other European countries. And they import a lot of consumer goods, vehicles, appliances, that sort of thing, are all imported into Latvia. Now a few words about Latvian history. 1184 looms big in Latvia. It was a very crucial date. Prior to that, not much happened in Latvia, but 1184 came along. And what happened in 1184 is that the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick I, and the Pope got together and they said, you know, we need to Christianize these people. They're just a bunch of pagans out there. So we're going to do something about it. And they convened what they call the Synod of Verona, and that happened in 1184. And to give you, just to size it up on a map a little bit, this is what Europe looked like at the time. The Holy Roman Empire was sort of the elephant in the room. The Iberian Peninsula was still pretty much controlled by Islam. The Anglican Empire was going strong and having an influence throughout Western Europe. The Swedes were doing well up there. Poland and Hungary were important players at that time, as was the Byzantine Empire. So that was 1184. Well, then in 1200, just a few years later, the Teutonic Crusaders part of this Christianization of the Baltic states took place. And this is when the Baltic people first became Christianized, you might say. Then 3 centuries later, a very important event took place in 1517. It was the Reformation. And until that time, just about everything had been under the influence of the Catholic Church. But when Martin Luther came along from the area from a line about this north, all these countries became Protestant. Church of England was established, and the Lutherans took over the Scandinavian countries, as well as this new Teutonic state that the Crusaders had developed. Then another couple of hundred years later, the Swedes became a stronger influence. They took over this North European area to a great extent. The Holy Roman Empire was falling apart. The Iberian Peninsula had been secured by Spain. France was a significant player now, and England and Scotland and the British Union was forming. Then in 1700, the Russians became significant players and took over the entire Baltic region, and they really were in control of that until the Russian Revolution in 1917. And at that time, that's when the Baltic countries first became independent countries in 1917. But that didn't last long, because after that, in 1940, the war started. Russia completely took over the eastern part of the country. Germany took over the rest of most of Europe, and this became the Eastern Front. And most of the battles were fought in this area, much to the chagrin of the Latvian people, because their country was overrun by military operations, and just about everything was destroyed. The United Kingdom is now fully formed and in operation. The war ends in 1945, and Germany is divided into 4 sectors. But when you look at the map, the winner, so to speak, in terms of land grab, are the Soviets, because they've taken over not only the eastern part of Germany, but they've got Poland, and just about all these Eastern European countries are under their influence. And so it isn't until really 1991 that independence is restored to these 3 countries, as well as to many other countries, and the map looks more like it does today, with countries pretty well defined as to what their territory would end up being. In 2004, Latvia joins the European Union. The European Union was established by these 6 countries in 1987. Oops, I keep hitting the wrong button here. The UK joined in 1973 and exited in 2020.
Yeah.
Most of the smaller European countries joined in the early 2000s. This is a list of the numbers, and I put up here just to impress you with the numbers. But I do want to point out a couple of things. What's important here is to compare the European Union and the U.S. In terms of size of population and territory. The European Union has about half again as many people as the U.S., which I think is significant. The GDP of the European Union and the U.S. is close to the same, about $20 trillion a year. What is also important is that the per population GDP is half, approximately, of what it is of the U.S. Very significant in terms of how well the European population is compared to our own population here. And maybe in graphic form, there's really only about half a dozen countries that make up 3/4 of the European Union, of the 500 million people. A term we don't hear as often anymore is the European Common Market, and there's several countries that are not part of the European Union: Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, Luxembourg, but they are part of the Common Market. And of course there's NATO, which looms big again in today's news. But what's significant about the NATO is that Ireland, Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, Austria, and some of these Eastern European countries are not part of NATO. Now there's a little country here that is actually not a country, but at the end of the Second World War, when all the leaders of the major countries met in Potsdam near Berlin, the Russians decided we needed a seaport on the Baltic Sea. So this little country here, the main city there is Kaliningrad, or used to be Königsberg, is actually part of Russia. It's a strange arrangement, but it stands to this day. Often been puzzled by that little piece of real estate there. Okay, now looking quickly at the geography, this northern European plain is a very shallow region of Europe, and it's should be of some concern because it's less than 650 feet on average in sea level, and if you look at the Baltic Sea in particular, all this that's in green is very shallow. There's a lot of area here in Finland. If you've been there, this looks like a piece of Swiss cheese. It's lakes everywhere. There's some small islands scattered around. This is all very low-lying area. And if you look at the watershed of the Baltic Sea, it's quite a large watershed, larger than the Columbia River watershed. Not quite as large as the Mississippi River watershed, but it's significant. And again, many waterways, many lakes. If you look at a bathymetry map, you'll see that how shallow the Baltic Sea is. On average 180 feet. In areas like the Bay of Riga and this spit of water here that goes up to St. Petersburg, also along the northern shore of Germany here, is very shallow and is in danger, I think, of being very much affected by rising water levels. Now, at this point, you might ask, well, what does this country really look like? And here it is. This is what Latvia looks like. It's a very flat area. I think the mean altitude is about 160 feet above sea level. A lot of water in between. There are a lot of bogs and mires and fens here that much of the year are frozen over, but much of the year also during the summer are just waterways. The forest there, even though they have a lot of trees, they're spruce forests, which is not very good structural wood. So a lot of it is just used for pulp and paper products and that sort of thing. But it doesn't come anywhere close to the forest that we have here in the Northwest. The highest point in Latvia is about the same height as Council Crest here in Portland, about 1,000 feet. And as has always been the practice in the past, when the first potentate, one of those Teutonic knights, came in here, he built his first castle here at the highest point. When he built it, it was just a wooden structure 800 years ago. It now is a more formidable masonry structure. Has a small pond with it. There's a seashore of about 300 miles in Latvia, but again, you notice there are no cliffs or high points along the waterline. The main city in Latvia is Riga. It has a population about the same as the Portland area. It's also similar to Portland in that it's on a waterway along a river, much like the Willamette River. There are not very many high buildings in town because it's all built on a very silty soil. This whole area is very much a silty area. There's some interesting buildings here that were built. This building here, which is now an art center, was built by the Soviet Union. There's a communications tower back here for television, and the airport is out in that region too. But you'll notice none of these bridges are drawbridges because this is a very silty river. You cannot bring a large ship into it. Barges can go under those bridges, but no major river traffic. The old part of town is over here to the immediate right. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this building here. That's the City Hall, which has a very large solar panel on the top, which is understood as the largest solar panel on a...
Looks like there's a lot of solar throughout the whole area.
There is a lot of area because that's very essential to them because they have cold and long winters. You'll notice there's a small cruise ship here. That's about as far as it can go because it's not going to go under this bridge here. And Samsung is in the tallest building in town. Samsung is a major supplier of appliances and commercial goods. Rainfall is not that significant in Latvia. About 2/3 of what we get here. We get about 35 inches of rain here. Latvia, 24 inches. Average snowfall about 4 feet. And this is typical of the kind of forest that you see. Fairly small softwood trees, not particularly suitable for construction. This is the old part of town, and interesting about these two buildings here, they were built in the 17th century, totally destroyed during the Second World War, and have been restored, as has been in much of in Europe. You've been to cities where they've restored buildings to look like they did hundreds of years ago. That panoramic photo that you saw was taken from this spire up here. The old town looks really more like this. These are buildings that have maybe been constructed in the last 100 years, so not really that old as far as buildings go. This is the Latvian parliamentary building, kind of like the capital of the U.S. would be the equivalent. Latvia has a 100-seat unicameral parliament. In other words, just one chamber. And as you scan through the audience here, you'll notice that there are relatively few women. My guess is it would be fewer than maybe 10% are women in the Latvian parliament. The prime minister is addressing the parliament at this point. However, they do have a female who is a Speaker of the House at the present time. The two leaders, the parliament is elected every 4 years, and then the parliament in turn elects a president, who at this time is President Vionis. And he then in turn appoints the prime minister. So this is kind of like the president of the corporation, this is the CEO. And the prime minister right now, this is very interesting, Arthur Cairns. He was born in Wilmington, Delaware. to Latvian parents. His parents had I couldn't figure out what kind of a business, but a successful business in Latvia. And he went to Latvia after his parents retired to run that business. And I guess he ran it effectively enough to where they made him prime minister. But it's unusual to have a senior member of the government be born in a foreign country. This is at City Hall with that elaborate solar panel on top. It looks like a very traditional building, but it's a brand new building, made to look like it might have been 100 years ago. This is the Riga Esplanade, which is sort of the Champs-Élysées of Riga. There's an opera house back here. Here's that Soviet building I mentioned, some other civic buildings. And in the middle is this monument, which is very important to the Latvian people. That monument is the Freedom Monument. It's kind of it's their equivalent of a Statue of Liberty, but it doesn't serve the same purpose. At the top of it is the statue that holds 3 gold stars. Originally, they symbolized 3 regions of Latvia, but now they represent all 3 Baltic states. And at the bottom of that statue is the inscription for fatherland and freedom. So that's the Freedom Monument. It was left undisturbed by the Soviets. They tore down everything else, but for some reason they preserved this. Now this is a very interesting building. It sort of out of character. It has a 12-foot steel fence, spiked fence, small windows, possibly bulletproof windows. Looks like a fortress. And I was surprised when I found out what this building is. It's on the outskirts of town, and this is not the only building. This is not the only embassy building now in the world, U.S. embassy building in the world. There are a lot of other embassy buildings that are now built this way. I think primarily for protection from, I don't know, potential arriving people or from like terrorist groups. Compare that to the UK embassy in Latvia. Looks much more traditional. Certainly doesn't have a 12-foot fence around it. This is the University of Latvia. My dad did his undergraduate work here before he ultimately came to this country. Again, the building is quite new. This is a pride and joy of Latvia. It's their national library. Library's been in existence for 100 years, but this building was only built in about 5 years ago. It's won many architectural awards. Can't say that I personally see much beauty in that, but apparently if you're an architect, you would. A little bit about the Latvian language. Latvian, that's what the language is called, or Lettish, is an Eastern Baltic language similar to Lithuanian, somewhat similar to Polish, but completely different than Estonian or Finnish, which are 2 languages that are what they call Uralic languages that originated in the Ural Mountains of Russia. Oops. 80% of the population can speak Latvian, but most people also speak any number of other languages. People are fluent in Russian, English, German as well. Now, I don't speak Latvian. I left the country when I was 3 years old and never learned the language. But I had somebody speak this last sentence, and I want you to hear that.
Latviešu valoda izklausās šādi. Par to Latviešu valoda izklausās šādi. Par to runā mazāk nekā 1,5 miljons cilvēku pasaulē. Runā mazāk nekā 1,5 miljons cilvēku pasaulē.
There you have it. I'll play it one more time and see if you can pick out at least one word out of this thing.
Latviešu valoda izklausās šādi. Par to runā mazāk nekā 1,5 miljonus cilvēku pasaulē.
Million Latvian.
Well, you can see that language like that is not going to persist in the modern world. I think this is a language that 100 years from now is probably going to be a historic language, perhaps. And even now, most official, especially dealings in the UN, are conducted in English. So, you know, it's pervasive. That's going to take over in time. Okay, let's talk a little bit about names. How about this name?
Yeah. How do you pronounce it?
Well, we're going to get to that.
Oh.
Let's talk about the first name first. How would you pronounce it?
Gunnar.
Well, it derives from Gunnar Hamundarson, who was a fabled warrior in the Norse saga. And fabled and saga are the two operative words, because the Norse people did not have a written language. So all of their history has been passed down from generation to generation. So a lot of it is very fabled and it's more of a saga than it is a history. But Gunnar Hamundarson was the husband of Brunhilde, who was figured very significantly in the Norse saga. And we won't discuss the Norse saga this morning, but anyway, so that's the origin of the name. In Icelandic and Norwegian, they add an extra R, and they say Gunnar, with an emphasis on the end. Of course, my name was Swedish, and so we had Gunnar, Sven, Björn, Vita were the 4 children of the family. In Latvian, male names end in S, so there's an S appended to it. Female names end in A, and that's true in some other Eastern European countries. When I was drafted into the service, I became a gunner and served 2 tours in Vietnam as a gunnery officer. And this held over also to Portland Old Boys. You'll notice on my name tag, I'm gunner. However, Alan now has a new name for me. He sent me an email the other day. He called me Hunter. Now, there's another name, Günther, or in this country mispronounced Gunther. That is a German name. That is not a Swedish name with Swedish origin. Now, I'm sure that all of you have at some point, well, not all of you, but many of you have been given this as a gift or taken this upon yourself to do this. You spit into one of these tubes and send it in for DNA analysis.
Oh.
Well, I did that too, just for the hell of it, because I thought it'd be fun to see how misguided I am. And this is what I got back from Ancestry DNA. It was 98% of my ancestry is in these 2 blobs here. My father's family obviously came from the north, and my mother's from the east of Europe. But I was always told that my mother's family came from Sweden. So how did her background fit into this area? Well, upon doing a little bit more genealogical research, found that her family really came from an area called Silesia, which is not a country, but it's an area that is bordered by Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic. It's a very significant area in the recent history because that's where much of Europe's coal is located. So this was very important to the Nazi government. It's to this day important to the German and Polish governments. Apparently from there in the 17th or 18th century, some portion of the family moved up here to Sweden and then subsequently to Latvia, and that's how I derived my quasi-Swedish heritage, although really my heritage is really from the east of Europe as well as from the north of Europe. Okay, that's part of the name. Now, how about this last name? That is one that really is a puzzle to many people. But it's also very simple. If we divide it up into two parts, settle in Latvian means saddle. And then niek is a maker or craftsman. You put the two together and you have a saddler. And many other settling branches of the family that some moved to England, some moved to this country. Now at this point you're asking, what does a Latvian actually look like? There's a Latvian right there. This fellow lived about 100 years ago. He was a peasant farmer. He had built his own house. He had a cow. He had a horse. He had some pigs, chickens. He had a wife. He had 6 children, 4 of whom survived into adulthood. And he's my great-grandfather. He's a pretty happy-looking guy considering how and what primitive conditions he lived at that time. This is long before Latvia was even formed. His son, my grandfather, on the other hand, was a Lutheran minister and school teacher. Very dour-looking guy and a very dour individual indeed. He was a fire and brimstone preacher. Never was a very happy fellow, and after the war was over, chose to go back to Latvia, even though it was still under Soviet control at the time. This is my dad, who had the good fortune of coming to this country, and consequently also brought the family here years later in 1951. And here's the last of the Mohicans. Okay, so I've told you about Latvia, I've told you about my name. I'm going to conclude, play a very brief video. It's more or less a travelogue of Latvia. But be alert, because this thing is moving very fast and it's over before you can blink your eyes. There you have it.
So have you ever been there?
You know, I had my dad wanted to go back before he left us. He wanted to see his country one more time. Had a ticket in hand. I was going to go with him, as was my sister. And I was still working at the time, and a big flap came up at work, and I couldn't go, and my son went instead. But I've never been back to Latvia.
Oh, really?
And I really don't have any desire to go back. It's a very impoverished country.
Yeah.
I feel badly for the people. So many of them, the younger ones, as is true of many other impoverished countries, have left to find their fortune elsewhere. And it's very hard to make a go of it. And part of it is they have no natural resources to speak of. And the meager forests that they have, they do the best they can with what they have. Yes, sir.
Does Latvia have a mosquito problem?
Mosquito problem? You know, I think it's so cold in the wintertime that mosquito doesn't have a chance. I mean, it literally gets down to 40 below. That's where 40 centigrade and 40 Fahrenheit cross over, you know. So, Elmer.
Is the population decreasing in the last 5 years or so?
It is not rapidly, but as I mentioned, at the time Latvia became independent in its formal independence in 1990-91, had about 250,000 people. No, not 2.5 million people.
Yeah.
It's now down to less than 2 million. And as far as I know, it's still declining.
And young people are able to travel to Europe freely, no passport.
Yeah, it's part of the Schengen agreement. You can cross the borders. I mean, you can travel anywhere you want to go. And you can also seek employment elsewhere, and that's what a lot of younger Latvians are doing. Because there's just not enough for them in the country.
What was your history when you left? Did you go to Germany, or what did you go after?
Well, that's another presentation I can make another time. There was from 1940, when the war started in effect, until I left in 1951, I must have moved a dozen more times. And part of the problem was, finding employment for my dad to subsist. So he finally, against his best wishes, he went back into Germany, in the very northern city of Germany, Flensburg. And he taught at a maritime school there, which that maritime school now is the Naval Academy of Germany. And so we survived that night. Most of my grammar school education was in that town in Germany. Michael?
Yeah, what was the experience in Latvia, I mean, the gist of it in the Second World War? And how did it deal with the transition between Nazi occupation and Russia? And one of the reasons I asked that is that I did have an opportunity to visit Estonia a dozen years ago. And they have a museum there about the Second World War. And so the guide who was taking us around, he made a very strong point of pointing out that most Estonians preferred their lives under the Nazi regime, not the political side of it, but just the people, and were very, very resentful of Russian occupation. Is that?
Well, I think that's a good assessment, because the Russians occupied the land from way back when until 1940. And even though after the Russian Revolution and the Tsarist was taken out, the countries became independent briefly. That's why their history goes back, to 1910. They claim that to be the year of independence. But then very quickly the Soviet Union took over, and even though they allowed the countries to identify themselves as separate countries, they were very much subjected to the Soviet regime and very much under their control. And the thing that's unfortunate is, as I showed you in one of my maps there, this area became the so-called Eastern Front, where the Russians and the Germans were fighting back and forth, and tanks and whatnot overran the country. Hardly a building was left standing. And so there's trying to do, like, for instance, genealogical research, or no records kept, everything was destroyed. And as a consequence, a lot of infrastructure was destroyed, bridges and highways and so forth. So it left the country in very poor condition. I think the greatest thing that ever happened to Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania and many other countries was the European Union, which may be a little controversial to some people in this room. So I think Latvia holds some promise. I think maybe in the next 100 years it'll flourish. It's hard to say.
At what point in history, you talk about the Baltic states as like three peas in a pod, but they're clearly not. At what point were they ever unified as unified people?
No, they never were, because they don't share a common language. Their culture is a little different, and I think people have often talked about, well, why don't you all get together and you form a little bit bigger country? But I think now with the European Union and NATO and so forth, there's a lack of interest in doing it right now.